I'm looking over my Volume 2 Western Trout Fly Tying Manual. It was 1980 when we first produced this book, and this year we revised it. And the man that did the revision for me, in fact he was the editor on the first one, is my friend Bruce James. Bruce has guided for me, he's worked in our store, and he's taught fly tying here in Jackson Hole. He's been a part of my life for over 20 years. Bruce knows a lot about fly tying, and he knows about it from the guide's perspective. Being a guide, Bruce has a different perspective into fly tying. He ties flies that are simple and that really work. I think you'll enjoy getting some instruction from my good friend, Bruce James.
Thank you, Jack. The fly that I'm going to tie here is called a jugulator, and this particular fly came from Volume 2 of Jack Dennis Fly Tying Manual, and basically it's just been something that we've taken and changed a little bit. It works really well on the snake. We used it this year on the one fly contest in Jackson Hole. And it wasn't the winning fly, but it did better than I ever thought. We've been testing it out for a while. What I've got here is this is a 710 Dairiki hook. This right here is 6/0 monocord. We're going to take and we're going to cut out a little piece of elk hawk. This is a real stiff elk. Makes a really good tailing material for flies. And remove any little hairs here. Sometimes you may have to stack this, just depends on how nice and even it is. Sometimes you can get by without. I become very, very particular about fly tying materials when I'm choosing hairs, because if you're not, you'll end up with the wrong texture and it won't work very well. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hold this on top of the hook and I'm going to tie it in. And just use your fingers to keep it on top of the hook as you tie it back towards the back. There we go, we got the tail in right there. Now I was wetting my fingers down a little bit. I get a little bit better, might say, traction. If they're a little wet, it's a lot easier to dub. This right here is March brown colored dubbing. It's a fly-right in particular. Although I have in other times used hare's ear dubbing. That works also very well. Put a little bit of this on the hook and we'll get a little batch going here in the back. This right here we're going to grab next is a bleached grizzly. Comes off a Hoffman's saddle. Prepare this a little bit and we'll tie it in back here, and we'll continue to dub a body towards the front here. Takes a bit of dubbing to do this depending on the size of the fly you're tying. Most of the time I'm tying this in 6s and 8s. Rarely you'll tie it in a 10. It's a fairly good size hook, but the bug, which is a stonefly that it imitates, is pretty good sized. So you want to have a good sized imitation for this guy. Put some more of this dubbing on here and continue to dub a body. You notice I don't put a lot on at any time. The key to dubbing is putting a small amount on and building up layers rather than putting great big huge gobs on. Beginners quite commonly goof that way. They'll put great big gobs on and then they can't get it to stick very well. Okay, we'll take, now if this were a regular type of hackle, such as a neck hackle, you would probably have to use a pair of hackle pliers, but this being as long as it is, I can just take it and wrap it with my fingers. What you have to do kind of depends on how long the hackle that you've got is. This just ribs the body. Also helps it float a little bit better. Trim it. Okay, now what we're going to do, we'll put a couple little whip finishes in here, and we're going to take and change threads, because in the next step we're going to be putting some hair on that's a little stiffer, and if you use a thinner thread it will probably break on you, which we don't want that to happen. We'll trim that off. Okay, this is basically bleached elk. It's long. You don't want it too awfully soft, but you don't want it too wiry. You have to be kind of particular as to the kind of elk that you choose. I went through a lot of packages of elk in the fly shop before actually choosing this particular one right here. I'm just going to hold it in my fingers here and get some of this stuff out. Then we'll take it and we'll put it in the stacker and stack it so it's nice and even. Stacking here makes it look a lot nicer, and sometimes when it's really uneven, it's the only way to make it look even halfway decent. We'll grab it by the tips right here. Now sometimes you're going to end up with some little fibers here, so we'll take and brush those out so that we don't have those in our wing here. I want this to come back to just about where the tail ends. We're going to trim this off nice and neatly. Okay, now if you want to make this a little bit more durable and also make sure that it ties in well, it helps to put a little bit of glue right here where the tie-in is, and sometimes I'll even put it right here on the elk itself. We'll hold it right up here, come around with a loose wrap, gonna tighten as we go here. Yeah, we've got a pretty nice wing right here. The next thing we're going to do is put on some antelope hair. Antelope hair flares very easily, and it's really nice to use for clipped heads, providing that you're not going to actually have any kind of a collar. The ends are real brittle and they don't work very well for a collar, so you want to keep that in mind. I've got a nice bunch here, get some of the underfur out of it. You can also use a mustache comb to do that if you have a mustache and have one of those kind of hanging around. I'm lucky to have that little item on my face, I suppose. Put a little head cement on here to cement it right to the hook, and away we go. Come around a couple times loosely, and then we'll pull her. And then we'll just go through it a little bit here towards the front, pulling tightly. I'm going to push it up. I'm going to put another batch on. Same as last time. The size of the batch depends on how big the previous batch was and how close you are to the head. If you're really close to the head, you're going to have to alter the batch size so that it's not quite so big, or you're going to crowd the head and be in trouble. It's one of the things that beginners have trouble with, is they'll crowd the head quite commonly. We'll spin this around here a bit. Pull her back. Get some wraps in front of it. And I'm just going to put a couple half hitches on it here. because it's time to trim. Anyway, who's ever wanted to be a barber, this is your perfect opportunity right here. I think that's one of the things about fly tying that I always found was kind of interesting is, I guess, I always like cutting hair because I enjoy cutting trimmed heads like this. We want a nice big head on this fly, so don't come too close or you'll spoil the way it floats and the way it looks. This particular vise here rotates, which makes it real nice. You don't necessarily have to pull the fly out of the vise to trim it. Sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. It just kind of depends. If I'm commercially tying a bunch of these, what I'll do is I'll actually go through steps in which I may actually only do a bunch of bodies and come back and trim them later. And in that case, of course, I would trim them out of the vise. But when I'm tying one as I'm right now, it doesn't necessarily have to be pulled out of the vise to trim it, if you have one of these rotary vices, that is. They are definitely indispensable for tying certain types of flies. Gives you a pretty good idea what's going on underneath. Get all these little miscellaneous hairs out from around the head. Trim pretty nice and flat down here. A little bit on the front. Kind of a, not really a bullet shape. Depends on what kind of a bullet I suppose you're thinking about, but if you've seen Jack Dennis's book, Volume 2 of the Fly Tying Manual, the jughead is the fly that this actually is patterned after. And it's got a nice rounded head on it. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and tie on some thread again. This is the thinner thread, because all we're really going to use this for is just tying on the legs. And there's a lot of things that you could do. A lot of people will tie this on while they're tying the fly rather than tying it on right now. Kind of depends on how nicely you want the fly to look. I don't really think it hampers the fishability of the fly, and certainly makes it a little easier to deal with tying it for most people. Now we're going to take some of this brown rubber leg material, 2 strands, and we're going to hold her on top up here, tie it in loosely so that we can take and move it around to each side. Just check, make sure we've got it moved around right here. That looks pretty good. Now we'll cinch it down a little bit more. Some more thread wraps. Make sure at this point you don't pull too hard because it'd be easy to break the thread. Kind of mess things up a bit. We'll come in here with a half hitch or 2, and we can be done with this. Now we'll take and we're going to trim these legs. The action of the legs in the water, I think, is what really gets the trout with this particular pattern here. Originally when we tied this, we didn't use any legs on it, and you had to skitter and skate it across the water. But after putting legs on it, it makes it a lot easier to fish it without moving it a whole bunch. And here we go right here. This is it. We'll put a little bit of head cement on the place where the legs are tied in here. And we'll put some on the head here too, where the thread is. And we are set to jet. Just like that. Nice pattern to use. I wouldn't use it real early in the season unless you have good stonefly hatches early in the season. I mean, golden stones, but later on when we get the golden stones in this part of the territory, that works really well. Well, there it is. This is a jugulator. This is one heck of a fish catch and fly, and I think you'll certainly enjoy using it. I have.